Everybody, thanks for coming. Very happy to have Jason Ketola today. Is that how you pronounce it?
Mm-hmm.
Wow. I have an impossible last name, so I'm sensitive to mispronunciations. Jason is the CEO of MaxMind. COO. I said COO, no?
Okay.
I'm just incoherent. COO of MaxMind. Real world moral dilemmas at the most popular IP geolocation and fraud detection provider you've never heard of. So without further ado, Jason, take it away. Thank you so much for coming.
Thanks for inviting me. So just before getting started, I'm curious if anyone had heard of MaxMind before seeing the talk advertised. Okay, so besides to inviting me. Okay, that's great. That's what I expected. Unless you work in web development, it's very unlikely you would know the company or maybe something to do with server administration, network analytics. I'm really not a marketing person, so I was looking online about how to come up with a clickbaity kind of title, because I'm usually just a very straightforward, boring person. So that's why I came up with this. Yeah, so that you've never heard of it part, that seems about true. The most popular, I actually don't have any empirical evidence for that, except that I've been working in the field for 10 years, and there actually isn't another company that does both these two things. So we just are the most popular, I think. IP geolocation and fraud detection, I will tell you about those more today. My main intention is to describe 4 different real-world moral dilemmas that we face at MaxMind. It's hardly exhaustive of the list of moral dilemmas that we face, but I think they'll be interesting to each of you. And in each case, there are both moral and business-related issues at stake. So they're not. We don't analyze them purely from a moral perspective. But first, I'll give you a bit of history on the company and say a little bit about our products to give you some context for the 4 dilemmas. So MaxMind was founded as an IP geolocation provider in 2002. It's quite a while ago, especially for a tech company. We started offering an e-commerce fraud detection service in 2004 as well, so that's the other side of our business. And the reason we did that was because people were defrauding the company. They were using stolen credit cards to try to buy our IP geolocation databases. So came with a product that we used internally, and then we sold it to others. And then in 2010, I joined, and there were 7 of us at that time. Today, there are about 50 employees, and the GeoIP data, that's the name of our IP geolocation data. Again, I'll get into what that means in a minute, but it's used by well more than 5,000 companies worldwide. It very likely is the most popularly used IP geolocation source, and in part that's because we have a free version of our software, of our data set that's available, and that's used in many different open source products. And our fraud detection services are called MinFraud. Those are used by more than 7,000 companies, and we're screening about 2 billion e-commerce transactions a year. So it's a lot of different transactions. Something to add about MaxMind, it's a privately held company, and it continues to be owned entirely by the founder. So what that means is that we don't face the same constraints that many other companies do if they're public or they have a whole bunch of different stakeholders making the final decision on things. So I'll first talk to you a little bit about what our IP address is. It's important for understanding some of the dilemmas that we face. So these are examples. The first is an IPv4 IP address. The second is IPv6. IP addresses are used to identify devices on networks. So that could be like your home network, on the internet generally. It's how computers, it's essentially their address. Which computer, it's an address so that computers can communicate with each other. They can find the other computer that they want to send data to. You might be familiar if you were setting up your home Wi-Fi or a network. There are 2 different types, which I mentioned here, IPv4 and IPv6. It's not extremely important to know, but I would just want to give you a little bit more information about them. For IPv4, this is just one way of representing an IP address with dots in it. That's probably the one you're most familiar with. It can also be a binary string of 32 digits or 32 bits. IPv6 addresses, the second type, are just now becoming more popular. I mean, they've been around for a while as a concept, but there are many more of them. The reason why there are this second type of address is its own topic. However, essentially when the addressing system was created for computers on networks, there was an assumption made that there would never be more than 2 to the 32 devices on the network. So that's 4.3 billion different devices in the world, but there are many more devices than that. I mean, there are more people than that. So just think of all the devices you own, and there are many more devices than that on the internet. And so a new addressing scheme was required. So that's why the second type, IPv6, the number of possible IP addresses there is something like 3 times 10 to the 38th, which is just an astronomically large number. We'll never run out of those. The most interesting IP addresses are those that are routable on the public internet. So like if you go on to a website or if it's the address that will be used, say, for that site or for your cable modem that you're using to connect to the internet. When you're on a home network, you're typically using a set of private IP addresses. These are used many times over in different small networks. They don't give you any special information. They're not really unique. The ones that are on the public internet are unique, and so those we can start to pair information with and say interesting things about. IP addresses can be static or dynamic. That means that sometimes an IP address is just fixed to a particular device, and other times your IP address will change. So if you have a cable modem at home and you have an IP address that is assigned to it, and it's probably going to change every few months. Just Comcast or RCN or something will change the IP address that's allocated to your cable modem. That would be an example of a dynamic IP. A static IP would be like this 8.8.4.4. That's the IP address for one of Google's public DNS servers. So it's just fixed. It's always, Google owns it. It always points to their public DNS server. So I'm going to show you some examples of what MaxMind does with IP addresses in our data set. But first I want to say something about why is there a business need for providing information paired with IP addresses. The most popular being IP geolocation. And the first reason is that there's no inherent connection between an IP address and a location or any other information. It's not built into the system that you can just look up an IP address and know, say, where it's being used. So they're bought and sold all over the globe, and they're traded hands between different registries constantly, and you and I can go online and buy IP addresses that we want to use as well. People want to use them, or companies want to use them to target content and advertising. Like when you visit their website for the first time, bostonglobe.com or something, they don't know anything about you, but if they have your IP address, then they might be able to show you some content that's targeted to your location if they're using a data product like ours. They might say, okay, this person came from this IP address, they're located in Medford, and we can show them an article or some advertising relevant to Medford, Home Depot near Medford, something like that. It's also used for digital rights management. An example there would be Netflix or Hulu. If you've ever tried to access content from a different country, or let's say you're outside the US, you wanted to access your content here, they blocked you and said, nope, there are geolocation restrictions on this. That's due to licensing deals they have with different companies. And so they'll use IP geolocation information to try to guess where you are and enforce those restrictions. Another example is load balancing. So a company that's providing wants to deliver content to you very quickly. Say Facebook will have different servers located all over the world, and they want to know when you connect to Facebook, which are the servers that are closest to you, and those are the ones that you'll connect with. They'll send you the content for their app and pictures and things so that you get the fastest load times, the fastest responses. So that's why people are interested in these kinds of data sets. This is an example from our one of our web services. It's called Insights, but that really just means what's all the data that we return. So when someone sends us an IP address, so in this case, I just picked a random IP address, and this is, if someone were to send this to us, company, this is the kind of information they would get back from us. So a country, location, postal code, that's some kind of accuracy radius, so we think it's within 10 kilometers of that postal code. The ISP that's being used there, so here it's RCN, and we categorize that as a residential type IP address. Someone's using this is an IP address that belongs to someone in their home, and we're providing some confidence values for how confident we are in the different data elements that we returned.
Those are percentages?
Yes, yeah, yep. The confidence is 0 to 100. One thing I want to point out is that, because it'll be important later, we also include this approximate coordinates. So that's a latitude and longitude. That is not the pinpoint on the globe where the IP address is being used, but it's a point within that postal code or whatever the smallest region we might send back to the customer. Sometimes we don't know the postal code. We'll just say the state or the country, and that'll be a point roughly within the center of that, or population center.
What's a subdivision? Where you have 90% subdivisions?
Oh, okay. So yeah, so subdivision is the state. So it's really just that, like Massachusetts here,
Okay.
not every country has state as a relevant concept, so we just use the term subdivision. Yep.
Sorry, I'm a bit confused about one thing.
Yes.
So if there's a company and they have multiple computers, would it all be the same IP address, or?
Oh, okay. So that's a great question. It is
Like an organization with many computers?
like here. Okay, good question. So it can be. It depends what those computers are doing. So typically, okay, let's say there's a guest network here at UMass Boston. I signed on to it earlier, and what's happening there is that each computer does not have its own public internet IP address, publicly routable IP address. All of the computers are connecting to a smaller network on the campus, and then there's something called a proxy server that all of the information is getting run through, and then that computer or that proxy server has its own IP address. So to the outside world, if that's all they can see from all the devices that are connecting through the guest network, they're just seeing that IP address there, which is at the proxy server level.
Okay.
There's no publicly routable IP address on your particular
So you
device.
would need to find that specific computer?
So okay, that's a good question. So if you were to connect from, I actually have it as an example coming up. So,
by the way, this is why it's called the internet. It's interconnected networks.
Yeah.
So there's a UMass network, there's a MIT network, there's a your home network, and they're all connected together through all of these routing mechanisms.
so this I looked up the results that we returned for the IP address that is exposed by the UMass Boston guest network. So I went online, typed what is my IP address. It's kind of cut off here, but there just is one. Believe me. I looked up what the results are. These are the data from our data set that we returned from that. So if you go on the guest network right now and you were to visit a site and the company looked up your IP address at MaxMind, and if I went on, in both cases they're getting the same information returned back. So part of there's a whole.
If I'm doing something illicit from here on campus, there's no way to trace the specific computer
Yeah, that's what I was wondering. Like,
Oh,
if there's
okay.
an investigation or something.
Yep.
How would you find out?
You'd have to come back to, you'd have to go back to UMass Boston. They would have access to, presumably, to logs or routing tables.
Would they use the IP address as a?
They would use an IP address. So they're also allocating IP addresses on the local network. These are private IP addresses, but they're not ones that Facebook can see when you connect to it, but they, within their network, can see those.
Okay.
And so they could look those up. There's other information about your computer and device that's getting exposed, but in terms of the IP address, right, they wouldn't know. They wouldn't know your particular device just based on that. That's actually a really good question. So there's no one-to-one mapping necessarily
Yeah,
between.
I was just wondering if there, like, I watch a lot of crime shows and stuff.
Yeah. Oh, it's usually fake.
I'm just like, how do you find out that this person, like, said this in this anonymous chat? Like,
Yeah.
Yeah, it requires subpoenas to organizations like UMass Boston to
Yeah.
examine their log files and things like that.
I mean, that's actually been a real question. For example, if students are on an internal network talking about immigration status, right? And then the IP location locates it to the campus, and the campus has said at least, we won't provide any more detailed information than that to the authorities. If, you know.
are they allowed to use that as a, like we found this on the server that someone is an immigrant that's
Is
not
who
supposed
allowed?
Are they allowed?
Who?
Like the police?
I think so, yeah.
They'd have to get a warrant to figure out.
Yeah, I know, but like, can,
Right, right. I mean, that can be the beginning of their investigation for sure. Would be the police in Massachusetts, but it would be the federal government.
What else did I want to say? Oh, yeah. So one important thing to note, and this might come up in the context, or might come to your mind because of the CSI type shows. MaxMind does not geolocate devices in real time. So we're not, when this, when I put this IP address into our web service, it's not instantly calling out to the device and trying to figure out where it is. We produce a database, in this case, our geolocation database, once a week. So we're really just providing a best guess. And we're putting together a database once a week to provide this kind of lookup table. So it's not perfect. It's going to provide some approximate information, but there's still business value to companies for that. We can't, but it also means we just can't charge as much as someone who could pinpoint exactly where you are.
Use this for like QI, like quality, quality assurance, like when they're, because I'm doing those type of reports here, and we look at like who comes up, which website is clicked, and how they find it. So would we also be able to find out like what location the people?
Yeah, if people are, that's a very popular use. It's kind of web analytics. If you want to know where your users are coming from of your site, just run your logs through this. Of course, you can use Google Analytics. They also have their own system for that. But but that's a very popular application. So we put together our database from publicly available sources of information, and we also have user-entered information that we collect from, like if you're filling out forms around the internet and you're putting in your location, where we have partners who we collect that kind of information from. Other companies there are other companies that do IP address geolocation. They have their own technologies that presumably are different from ours. This is an example of one where we returned a bit of incorrect information. I looked up the IP address that my phone was connecting through, and I used Google Fi for internet, and I used the VPN through Google. So what that basically means is that, like the guest network here, the traffic from my phone is getting routed through the server with this IP address, which is cut off, Ipv6 address, and then going out to the internet. And here we can only geolocate it, just that it's in the United States, because Fi subscribers are using the service across the whole US, so we won't say it's in this zip code because we just don't know. Presumably there are many thousands of people using this at any given time. And that coordinate is for somewhere roughly in the center of the US. It is definitely not a residential type of account though, so that's an inaccuracy in our data set. Yep, and I just showed you this example from here. So our other product is called MinFraud. It's a fraud detection service. This is a fancy graphic that basically just says, when you're placing a transaction on a website and you're putting in your credit card and all this information, it says, hold on a second while we process your order. A whole bunch of data about your order, which like the billing address you enter, the email, the IP address that you're connecting from to the merchant, potentially information about your browser, like the fonts you have installed, the screen size, the language that you prefer within your browser, a whole bunch of information is getting sent to us. We're running machine learning algorithms on it, and we have a whole heuristic system, and then we're sending information back to the merchant through, I mean, again, these are just names of different service levels we provide, but it's like kind of like how much information do they want, but we're telling them how likely is it that the transaction that you're looking at is fraudulent, or based on our assessment. And then we'll also, depending on if they want to pay more, we'll provide more information about how we came up with that calculation. Like the email has previously been associated with high-risk transactions, or a very rudimentary kind of check is just where is the location of the person based on their IP address versus the billing address that they entered for the credit card. So if those are wildly different, it might be a signal of fraud. It could also just mean the person's traveling. So that's where you have to be a bit more sophisticated about it, but that is a very, maybe that was the first check ever that existed in the context of fraud detection for online transactions, but that's a use of IP geolocation information. So people come up with attempts to circumvent our checks all the time, and it's a constant race. So next I'll discuss the first of the 4 moral dilemmas that have come out of this stuff, although the first doesn't touch on the technology quite as much as the other. So last year we had an employee who approached, early this year, sorry, we had an employee approach our CEO and me about concerns that we were selling to the National Cybersecurity Agency in Saudi Arabia. And the reason he found out was just that someone from this agency had an account with us, and they asked a question of our support staff. So this employee saw that and said, oh, I have concerns about this. The Saudi government has been implicated in killing of a journalist, and I'm concerned about their human rights record. Generally, I don't feel comfortable about you continuing to sell to this agency. The CEO at the company was unsure about what exactly to do in this case because it just immediately raises all sorts of questions. First, we looked back at precedent. In 2014, we'd encountered a kind of similar case where a company had wanted to purchase databases from us, and they were actually a security vendor that was providing tools that could be used by, we learned from WikiLeaks documents that were being sold to oppressive regimes to monitor citizens and journalists and activists and stuff. And at that time we said, we will not continue with that sale. We don't have a principle behind this. We just think it's probably bad. We're not going to do it. But they ended up not doing business with us anyway, so that was good. It was an easy problem to solve. In this case, this is an existing customer, and they use our IP geolocation database, just the standard one. We, in addition to looking at precedent, looked for third-party assistance because, of course, you can see this kind of thing in the news a lot now. People wondering at their companies or raising their voices about whether their company should engage in business with certain agencies. And although there's a lot of discussion of that type, there's not a whole lot of advice about when you're the company, how do you decide what to do in these cases. And furthermore, we don't have great expertise on the political situations that go on. We just read the news like anybody else, and this in our business is not determining what this agency is up to. It's just trying to create the best databases that we can. Ultimately, what we decided to do was establish an ethics committee, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. We next, what is sort of the procedure that we came up with, but we were sort of building the airplane as we were flying it. So this was the case that motivated the ethics committee, and I did a bunch of research and convened a group. I'll tell you a little bit about what we discussed. So we got a group together. I'll describe the composition in a second, but all sorts of considerations were brought to light. Like, does it matter if our databases are being used by this agency in bad ways? So we looked online, and the Saudi Arabian government, by some third-party watch groups, is implicated in using digital technologies to try to track dissident journalists and activists. But we don't. Yeah. So there's a whole. So I mean, so there are a whole bunch of. So it could be there's a plausible case that our data is being used, but we don't really know. Is it bad that we're merely doing business with that regime, even if our database isn't being used as part of any of the bad actions that they're taking? Should we even be transacting with them? Does that kind of legitimize these agencies? And we tried to come up to think about, well, what are the principles that we're following when making a decision about this? So imagining we don't want to sell to a government or to government agencies that commit human rights abuses. Well, that's if we just say any human rights abuses, that's basically rules out every government in the world. And we thought, okay, that doesn't really work that doesn't really work for us. The lesson for this cannot be we just shut down business. So that was kind of a non-starter, but we had a really tough time trying to figure out just what the right set of principles would be. I'll tell you what we hit upon, but one of the interesting facts about what came up was that people in our ethics group were very interested in raising all sorts of moral considerations with respect to this case, but they were very uncomfortable in general, minus the one person who raised it initially, to pass a judgment and say, this is the one that I'm committed to. This despite the fact that a huge percentage of them take pretty strong moral stances in their own lives about products that they buy or their lifestyle choices, or in companies that they do business with. Further, there was a whole lot of pressure on me within the group. They were asking me, well, what does the company want? As if I should just tell them what the decision procedure is and they will be happy to apply it. But I was trying to make the case that the whole reason we established the committee was that we didn't want to just have one or a few people within the management make a decision. We wanted to arrive at a decision by something closer to a democratic process, where we could recognize many different perspectives. So why didn't people want to commit? I'm not certain. It could be just the culture of the company. Nobody wanted to offend others. It might be just the personalities of the people we hire, but in any case, it wasn't easy. But we did come up with a few principles. The first, that we do not want to do business with or enable organizations or governments that are egregious abusers of human rights. We operationalize that. So that there's a whole question. Okay, what do you mean then by egregious abuse of human rights. And that's also not so simple. So we thought, well, we'll look at a bunch of third-party sources like Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch. They don't necessarily provide rank-ordered lists or the kind of thing that easily translates to a decision. Instead, they just provide you with a whole bunch of information. So we thought, okay, this is really difficult for us to parse. I did think about a book that I had skimmed previously by someone named Leif Weinar. It's called Blood Oil, Tyrants, Violence, and the Rules That Run the World. In this book, he makes the case that, he makes a both ethical and empirical case that buying oil from corrupt governments basically props them up, and that countries have a moral obligation not to do business with these oppressive regimes. He argues that they lack legitimacy as political institutions because of the way they treat their people and so on. But what was most interesting to me was that he provides some actually very clear policy prescriptions or in suggestions where he says, if a country were to adopt my approach, they should look at this, or they could look at this organization called Freedom House that ranks countries based on the level of freedom they provide to their citizens, and then just set some threshold level that they'll take action on. So we ultimately did that. We found the Freedom House worst of the worst list and decided we will not sell to any of the organizations that are associated with those government regimes.
But you don't make any like kind of damage assessment, right? So like you have, I don't even know what you call the data subjects that you harvested the information from, and that you're geolocating and that you're fraud detecting. Like what do you call? What's the language? What's the people? Your clients are the companies, right?
Oh, we could call it end users, data subjects. Yeah.
Okay, so you're evaluating the agencies, but like one could obviously be concerned about the data subjects or the end users that do not know that this vulnerability is even happening. They're not knowledgeable about you selling it. They don't know that this min fraud is going on in the background.
Right.
And you could make, like, there is certain like kinds of agencies that would take actions that would make precisely those end users more vulnerable, independently of which country they're in.
Yeah.
But that's not considered?
Well, we do. So, well, I guess we do try to consider what the risk is of the particular data that we're selling to them. We were trying to think, what could someone do with the IP geolocation database that we have? And we think that it's almost, it would be easy for anyone to access that data. Also, many other companies provide the same kind of data. So we don't think that I don't know if this is exactly what you're getting at, but we don't think that we're putting people at special risk by creating these databases, just because of some of the many of the inherent limitations within them. And there are ways to try to circumvent, the location. You could try to obscure your IP address through a number of different means. So maybe people would be doing that. I'm not sure if that's what you mean. But as a separate matter, we do go through a process of risk rating our own products, and we're actually obliged by regulations from Europe, the GDPR, to go through this process.
So I'm just wondering if there are organizations or like different companies, kind of similar, but also sells like data like information on the content of like messages and stuff, because right now what's happening in China with the Uyghur Muslims, I was wondering how they're like doing that, like, because when they see like what's happening there is that whenever they see a text or something involving someone being too religious or someone just practicing they like hound that person out and like actually go to their house
Yeah.
and do an investigation. So I'm wondering if they find out that information because a company is selling that information to them.
I don't know exactly how that operates in China, but that kind of thing would almost certainly be illegal in the U.S. anyway.
Oh. So companies aren't allowed to sell.
Well, they can sell. They can sell certain kinds of data. Provided that they meet certain criteria. These laws are actually these privacy-based laws are just coming into force now in the U.S. I mean, at a real serious level. There's one starting in California in January. Yep. And so you have to provide a certain kind of notice about what you're doing. People have to consent to information being shared. There are a whole bunch of different principles that have to be followed to comply with it. That doesn't mean people aren't doing questionable things with data, though, and selling it. It's certainly that's the case. So, so I just want to quickly say that we did come up with the second principle, which is this: that we want to consult many reputable and independent third-party sources, or as many reputable and third-party sources as possible to help us make determinations that avoid bias. Just because, as we researched those organizations like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch and Freedom House, there are criticisms of each and every one of them. There's no pure objective standard that for what counts as a, or objective adjudicator of who's determining what's a human rights abuse and not, and what's egregious and not. Okay, so the ethics committee is that we created. Its purpose is to advise our CEO. We decided that the committee shouldn't make decisions itself. And part of the reason for that is that just to protect the business in case the committee just decided that we should shut down the business, say. The CEO wants to have power to overrule that or come back and push back on it a bit. That's a crazy example, but it could be the case that our ethics committee would, if we gave the ethics committee full power over business direction, the committee could make a decision which was extremely damaging to the business itself. And so, just as a check on that, we decided that the committee would instead advise the CEO. And he has generally said, well, he'll follow the committee's advice, but he just wants a extra option just in case. So the members, there's no manager, direct reports included to try to reduce kind of power imbalances, try to pick people who are interested in these kinds of things and weren't going to just be bored or something. We found people from different departments and asked them to participate so that they could represent different interests. So the people doing machine learning, the people doing sales, and so on. What we do, if an issue comes up, we research it, deliberate, talk about it, we've met a few times. And we also decided that we would vote anonymously. And so that was in part to deal with the issue of people not wanting to make commitments and also to try to avoid social desirability bias. We wanted people to make be able to make true judgments and not feel worried that they were going to be punished or face, that somebody else is going to look down on them, say. And we also said that 2/3 must vote in favor of a resolution in order for a recommendation to be made. So in the case of Saudi Arabia, we made a resolution. It was something like the company should no longer sell to the Saudi Arabian government or associated agencies, and 2/3 voted in favor, and so we accepted that and discontinued doing business with 2 different government agencies in Saudi Arabia.
How many people on the committee?
8 people. As far as the resources that were useful in putting it together, the main one that I looked at was this one called Incorporating Ethics in Silicon Valley and Startups. That I found really useful. That was the most practical thing. So there's no shortage of literature from like business ethics about analyzing and weighing out these kinds of situations, but there was just a total lack of information available, practical information about how do you actually implement this within your company. So I was also reading about just how bioethics committees are set up and whatnot. And subsequently, just recently I learned that Northeastern and Accenture partnered on putting together putting together a report called Building Data and AI Ethics Committees. I wish I'd seen that because that's pretty good and it incorporates stuff like in the first two. I did want to mention that one person quit the committee after it started, and she said she didn't want to exclude customers on moral grounds. And interestingly, she's one of the kind of strongest personal advocates for different moral causes.
Why did you want to join the committee in the first place?
I think she didn't know that she held that view.
Oh, okay.
She kind of learned it through the process.
But there is a serious point in that, right? That there's a sort of slippery slope. That is when you begin to judge customers, you have a different attitude to customers.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, it's and other companies have taken different stances on these things. So just one that was in the news this last week is called GitLab, or maybe I don't know if last week, but just recently called GitLab, and they said no discussing politics at work. Also, we'll sell to anyone. If we shouldn't be selling to them, we'll just follow the law. So if you want it to be the case that we don't sell to this country or organization, have a legislator tell us that. Go get a law passed. And so that's a kind of one extreme example, whereas others are saying, okay, we won't sell to different organizations.
Was it a difficult decision for the company to like stop working with the Saudi Arabian like agencies and stuff, especially if they bring in a lot of money or, like
Yep.
I just want to know how it affects and how you guys made that choice.
It was okay. So there was actually not a lot of money at stake, and so that made it. It still wasn't easy in the sense that we wanted to be sure about that we weren't just being arbitrary. We wanted to have real reasons why we chose this path.
Do you think if it brought in more money, the CEO would have denied the ethics committee's decision?
I don't know. I mean, I don't think so, but I really don't. I really can't say. It certainly would have made it a harder decision.
Yeah.
Let's say if it were like an existential threat to the business to stop doing this. All right, so I want to talk about a second case of a second ethical issue or dilemma. This one's about misuse of data. And what happened here is, so this is an article that was published about MaxMind. And what happened was that this journalist discovered that people were turning up at a particular house located in Kansas and bothering the residents there. They were saying, where's my iPhone? I lost it, and it's I used IP geolocation or something. I came here or I looked up something online about, I don't know, they had some dispute with somebody online, and they wound up here claiming an issue. So the local police had kind of figured out, okay, it seems they actually didn't know what was going on. So it seemed. So as it turned out, what seemed likely to be happening was that people were accessing IP addresses related to disputes they were having with others. They were taking the latitude, longitude information associated with those, maybe putting them into a map somewhere, an online mapping service, seeing that it's located on the property of this farmhouse, and then heading out there to deal with business, do their business or whatever. And it isn't the case that any of those incidents were ever connected directly to MaxMind. However, the latitude and longitude that we return as being the approximate location for the center of the US is there. So there's a plausible connection, and that's why we got on the news, and this got picked up by NPR and the Washington Post. And it was, for being a company that nobody ever hears about, this was like kind of the worst sort of PR that, you could expect. We're just really unused to it.
But wasn't that a court case?
There was also a court case. Yep. So, yeah, I wanted to show you. These are the approximate coordinates of the U.S. Here's the new location, the inside of this water reservoir, not extremely far from that original location, but in a place where we don't think it can be plausibly connected to any residence or home. So the company had been around since 2002, as I mentioned at the beginning. This misuse wasn't on our radar until the journalists contacted us. And once we got contacted, we immediately took action. This was before any thought of a court case came up, but we just really didn't want to be if we were connected to this, we didn't want to be unintentionally causing harm to people. And since we could foresee it, and since we were able to locate some other reports that seemed similar in nature, including one which was definitely not connected to our data, we wanted to take action. So we didn't. One thing that we could have done is just remove this data point from our databases entirely, and then no one would ever, just ignore any of the disclaimers, and misuse it. But we had to balance that with the business considerations for why this is in the databases to begin with, and we added there as a convenience for our customers who need to make calculations about distances between different points, whether they're doing load balancing or showing content, customized content, or doing digital rights management. It's a lot easier with latitudes and longitudes than it is with the actual just names of locations. So what did we do? We updated our documentation. We went through all our documentation, made it even clearer what this data represented, what it should be used for. This included our client APIs, our marketing information. We added a new section to our licensing agreements with customers. We published on our blog about it. And we additionally created a system for reviewing all of our locations which are in our database, or all the latitude longitude pairs, and they're all getting adjusted to new locations. So there are approximately, there are almost 200,000 of these things. But this is an application we built internally for making adjustments. Here is the original point of a latitude and longitude pair. It's kind of on somebody's house here. And here it's being adjusted to this river.
But is your moral consideration mostly that it's wrong in the sense of misleading, that you think you have a location here and really it's this big radius average thing, or is it that somebody is exposed individually? So you could have accurate information that is like, I'm using my IP address, I actually live in a rural place, so it's pretty clear that there's only one house, and it is me, right? And then users could use it similarly and descend on my house. But now it would be accurate use.
That's an excellent question. The motivation tended to be the former. We didn't want people to misinterpret it. However, in the second case, we're addressing the second case in a way when we're doing this, because if I had an example to show you where there was just one house, we're still trying to move the point to a point that's significantly further away, or to some other landmark which might catch someone's eye, like a power station or something, or the.
So are you guys trying to move it away from houses across the board to landmark /
Yep.
neutral territory?
Yeah, parking lots, just and anywhere where it wouldn't be. It's possible that someone would go swim into this river to try to find their iPhone or whatever. I mean, but I don't know.
But really,
we-
just trying to
we-
identify it being personal.
Yeah, we want to do so, I mean, I guess in the other case where if the latitude and longitude did pick out a person and it was really intended to, that would be like an extreme outlier in our data set. It just isn't very likely that we would end up doing that. It's not outside the realm of possibility, but it's just the way that our service is set up. It's not intended to be so perfect.
Fine, right.
Yeah, fine grain. Because, like as I said, we're the smallest. Maybe I didn't make this clear, but the most granular data point we go to, location is the zip code, and so if that latitude and longitude, which just happens to be in the middle of it, happened to pick out the person who was using that IP, it would be more of a coincidence than anything.
By the way, going back to the previous topic for 1 second,
Yeah.
why would somebody with the amount of resources that the Saudi government has want, abstracting from the fact that you decided not to work with them, but why would they want a relatively non-granular service like this? Like, what could they do with it, as opposed to locating specific devices?
They may actually not be trying to do it. So if you read press releases about this agency, when it was created, it was they stated that the Saudi government was facing lots of hacking attacks from the outside, and it was just increasing, especially attacks on oil facilities. And so this agency was created in part to protect that infrastructure. So they might use the data as part of a security application, just trying to see.
Who's attacking?
Yeah, just to try to make some guesses about that. Of course, like a very sophisticated attacker is going to try to circumvent those things, but you kind of use all the tools in your arsenal when you're trying to
Got it.
figure out something like that. So yeah, that was actually an additional point that was raised in our deliberations. Well, maybe they're using it for a purpose that we would agree with. What do we do about that? Okay, this is just I wasn't sure how the screen would look here, so you can see it definitely is on somebody's house there. The third thing that I wanted to bring up is technological risk. And this is a decision we made to not pursue creating a certain kind of technology. The technology is called proxy piercing. But first I'll just go back and explain what a proxy is. So imagine this is this area here on the left. This is the UMass network. All of the PCs on the network are getting routed through a particular proxy point or firewall that protects the network and also limits the amount of traffic to some other things before going out into the world. That's a very common use of proxies, but another use that people have is trying to obscure for a site like Netflix what their true IP address is, because you want to view certain content and you want them to think you're located in a certain area. So in that case, you connect to this other server that's out, proxy server that's out on the internet, and then the website in the lower corner, say it's Netflix, sees the IP address of the proxy server. They don't see your original request. It's possible to, there are technologies that someone could create that try to get, so if we're Netflix, we can try to deploy a technology that runs on your computer and exposes your true IP address to us. So it kind of that kind of tricks it into connecting out to you directly, and then you know what the true IP address is, and you can do what you want with that information. So there are legitimate uses of proxies. So especially in countries that are run by oppressive regimes, journalists and activists might use proxies because they don't want to be tracked. People who just care about privacy generally. Other times they're used for illegitimate uses, like hiding that you're a fraudster. Or you might just want to circumvent geolocation controls by Netflix. So we were considering, because this was a hot topic in the early 2010s in the e-commerce fraud detection world, to create a technology called proxy piercing that would we could sell to customers so that they could figure out the true IP address of those who are connecting to their sites. Some of our competitors were advertising that they do just that. What we ultimately, there were business and moral considerations that we were looking at. Ultimately, we decided that it's too risky. We'll start holding data that could be very sensitive, especially in the cases of those like journalists and activists, that might put them at risk if someone were to, say, hack our site and get access to that information, or if they were to use our technology. So we decided that there's a high risk to running this sort of thing. But furthermore, we realized that it's not really necessary to achieve our business goals. When we're, say, doing fraud detection, we don't really need to know where the original person is located. If we know that they're using a proxy server, that's enough of a signal that we can connect to, or we can flag for fraud or not within our systems. We don't need to know, again, where they actually are coming from. Furthermore, from a business perspective, there were concerns about patents, just because others had created this technology and we knew held patents on it. But yeah, the moral decision here at the end of the day was just we didn't want to create a technology that didn't have a strong enough reason to overcome the risk that we were potentially putting others at. All right, the fourth area, or fourth moral dilemma area, is related to algorithmic bias. And
Can I just ask a
yeah.
question? Because often, both on a policy level and in the private market level, so I think the sort of the proxy piercing example is really interesting, because one of the arguments that's raised is essentially, if the competition is doing it, it eliminates the moral consideration. There's a large-scale example of that is there's this huge debate around autonomous weaponry about keeping humans in the loop, even though if the weapon system's operation, even though we have the technology for humans being taken out of the loop. And then the survey of a lot of national security officials is, well, once the Chinese sort of have their version with the human out of the loop, then that argument is over, because you put yourself at a disadvantage. That was a kind of interesting counterexample where that doesn't have. I was wondering, like, I mean, I realize that this is somewhat hypothetical in this case, but would that have come up, or do you expect something like that to come up in future discussions around not using or not moving forward with technology? Like, once your competitor does it,
right.
Is there still a moral point in
Yeah.
doing it yourselves?
Well, our competitors are doing it. I think maybe two things to say about that. One is there would have to be it also, just thinking back, it may have been a thing where there isn't a strong customer demand for this kind of thing. So the reason why you would want to have it as a customer is that you do not want to incorrectly, or you don't want to lose out on a sale because someone who tried to make a purchase on your site was using a proxy. And so they were flagged as fraud, but maybe they were trying to make a legitimate sale and you could have done business with them. If more people were if there was like a high enough percentage of people doing that, trying to make orders in such a way, then maybe just the market would just demand it. But the other thing too is that there's browsers, starting back around the time when we were thinking about this, browsers have been getting better and better about locking down the kind of information that they leak out, and that allows things like device fingerprinting or just uniquely identifying devices. And so it's a tough game to get into because you end up trying to work against the browser creators. The fourth area that we are concerned about is algorithmic bias. This is not really working on the algorithms for a fraud detection suite is not really my area of expertise, but we don't want people to be systematically and unfairly excluded from certain markets or from doing business with certain companies. From a business perspective, we want our algorithms to be as good as possible. Things that might happen, historically, a lot of online merchants would just block all transactions to certain countries like Nigeria or Vietnam because they saw a high level of fraud, so they just wouldn't accept them at all. So we're concerned about that. Sometimes it's easy to create an algorithm that biases certain kinds of emails as looking more legitimate or not. So let's say if you don't realize that outside the Western world, numbers as usernames within an email are very common, just all numbers, you might create an algorithm that raises the risk of what those look like. Same with names. If we train on the wrong data within our system to detect whether a name being sent to us looks real or not, we might incorrectly rate some names from cultures that we're not familiar with. Or with respect to browser attributes, someone might want to check, well, does the preferred language of the browser match the country that you're located in? Well, if you speak another language than the most popularly one spoken in the country, then if this kind of crude flag could introduce a kind of bias against you as well. In this case, what we've done is try to generate a whole bunch of ideas with our data analysis teams about what to flag and what to look into, do lots of investigations, made them try to socialize the concern, and explored some third-party toolkits. There are a few other things we've done, but those are probably the main things. So just to recap, these are the greatest areas of concern. For four of the kind of dilemmas we've encountered: who to sell to, whether people could misuse our data, what's the risk if we create a certain kind of technology, and could there be bias in our fraud scoring algorithms. I mentioned a little bit earlier that the regulatory environment is shifting, and so that's going to push it's going to push more and more companies to pay attention to this kind of thing, just to be compliant with the law.
Regulatory environment is shifting.
Yep. So the one of the main so there are many more privacy concerns related to data, and so there's a regulation called the GDPR coming out of Europe from 2018, and California Consumer Privacy Act, which comes into effect on January 1st, 2020. The GDPR places much stricter requirements on what you can and can't do with data and the way kind of chain of custody around data when you're taking it from EU data subjects. And the California Consumer Privacy Act provides a lot of protections, privacy-related protections for those in California. So it kind of will reduce because the fines and punishments for violating these laws are pretty large, or at least hypothetically are large, it should rein in a lot of companies who are playing fast and loose with the data that they hold. Yeah, if you think about it, a question. For the few who remain, you can email me.
Great, thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. Something I started asking you before. So the ethics committee meets ad hoc primarily, or
Yeah, we
does it seem useful for it to meet regularly or not really?
we haven't had so yeah, the ethics committee so far has met. We generated a whole bunch of topics for meetings, and so we met until we had exhausted those. I think what we'll do is have a periodic kind of check-in, maybe say 3 times a year. We'll like try to bring up articles that are popular in the news, because that's one of the ways that we find out about things to be concerned about. Algorithmic bias, being top of the list, or is concerned about who to sell to. So if we see things in the news that we're concerned about, maybe we'll discuss them there. Otherwise, if someone raises an issue, we'll just schedule a meeting ad hoc.
And in the business community, there's all this discussion of like an ethical culture in an organization as opposed to like a compliance culture. I mean, I guess as I think about it, this is a symptom that MaxMind at least has an ethical culture, because this, I'm assuming, goes beyond compliance. Is that like something that you, is that terminology something that you guys talk about in the management of a?
Yes, we've I've done presentations about the committee in all hands meetings, and also to senior staff or kind of the upper management about that, and just said that these are concerns beyond mere compliance, that we as people, moral creatures, do care about these things, and so we invite people to raise their concerns. I think it's very interesting what's happening at Google, for what I've read about it. I don't have any inside information, but there are just so many different voices there internally, and from what I understand, the debates can be protracted and sometimes sort of unmanageable. I mean, they're cutting into productivity, so I don't really know what would happen at MaxMind if we were just a different size company. I think there are all kinds of different factors that might affect it. It's pretty easy I guess that's the way of saying that, given the size of the company as it is now and the particular composition, it's relatively easy to roll out we're cared about ethics message.
That's interesting. And the kind of product in the end, even though it has clear privacy implication, the kind of product that you make because of its sort of medium granularity allows you to be more ethical with, not terribly high commercial stakes, which in Google doesn't seem to be the case.
We do have competitors who differentiate themselves from us by advertising that they do hyper-local geolocation, so they'll geolocate to a more granular level, and we've just elected not to do that. We don't think there's a strong business case generally for that. I mean, there are certain industries which certainly would want that, but we we don't see there's a strong business case, but also it just raises too many privacy concerns.
Yeah.
So we're kind of happy with where we've landed.
Yeah. It's a fascinating, actually, case study that flies into the face of this sort of libertarian dogma, where things have to happen at some point, almost by the inertive force of the market.
Well, I think Jason's also said, though, that none of these have represented an existential threat.
Right.
Would the CEO choose to follow a recommendation that said, "Yeah, you made enough money, guy. It's time to stop"?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. That's a good question. Thanks.
Okay, all right,
That
thanks.
was awesome.
Thank you.
very much.